In 1981, a Soviet surface-to-air missile battery locked onto an aircraft flying at 85,000 feet above their territory. They fired. The missiles screamed upward at Mach 3.5, one of the fastest weapons ever built. The plane didn't evade. It didn't drop countermeasures. The pilot simply pushed the throttle forward, and the missile couldn't keep up. That's the kind of machine we're talking about today. An aircraft so fast that the laws of physics themselves became its armor. But here's what most people never talk about. The SR-71 Blackbird wasn't invincible. It had limits. Real, dangerous, mission-ending limits. And some of those limits almost broke the entire Cold War intelligence program wide open. Let's go back to the late 1950s. The Cold War is running hot. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a silent war. No bombs, no infantry, but absolutely everything else. Espionage, proxy conflicts, and above all, a desperate race to know what the other side was building. The Americans had a problem, a massive one. The Soviet Union was enormous, closed, secretive, and its military infrastructure, missile sites, airfields, submarine pens, nuclear facilities was scattered across 11 time zones of territory that no American soldier could legally set foot on. So the CIA and the Air Force did something bold. They decided to fly over it. The first platform they used was the Lockheed U-2, a beautiful, fragile, high-altitude reconnaissance plane that looked more like a glider than a spy plane. It flew so high, around 70,000 feet, that American planners initially believed. Soviet radar couldn't even track it. They were wrong. The Soviets tracked every flight almost from the beginning. They just couldn't reach it. Until May 1, 1960, when they did. Francis Gary Powers, a CIA contract pilot flying a U-2 designated Article 360, was shot down over Sverdlovsk, deep inside Soviet territory. He survived. He was captured. And the entire American aerial reconnaissance program was suddenly catastrophically exposed to the world. President Eisenhower had to stand before the international community and admit the United States had been running spy flights over sovereign Soviet airspace for years. It was a diplomatic disaster of the first order. The U-2 program wasn't dead. It continued operating for decades, but the message was clear. If you're going to spy from the sky, you need something the enemy simply cannot touch. Something so fast, so high, so technically advanced that no weapon in existence can catch it. That something became the SR-71 Blackbird. Lockheed's Skunk Works division had already been developing the concept under Project OXC-ART, a series of aircraft designated with the A-12 designation. The A-12 was the CIA's version, single-seat, slightly smaller. The SR-71 was the Air Force's evolution larger, capable of carrying a two-man crew, and refined for sustained operational reconnaissance at speeds no production aircraft had ever achieved. Kelly Johnson, the legendary engineer behind the U-2 and dozens of other iconic aircraft, led the design team, and the challenges they faced were almost incomprehensible. At Mach 3.2, the Senior 71's cruising speed, friction with the atmosphere heats the aircraft surface to temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Aluminum melts. Conventional aircraft structure would come apart. So Johnson's team used titanium. Staining that titanium created one of the strangest ironies of the Cold War. Much of the raw material was secretly purchased from the Soviet Union through front companies. Because the United States didn't have enough domestic supply, the Soviets, unknowingly, helped build the very aircraft designed to spy on them. The SR-71 first flew on December 22, 1964, at Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale, California. Test pilot Robert Gilliland took the aircraft up for the first time and immediately recognized what everyone involved already suspected. This was something from another category entirely, not just another fast jet. Something categorically different from anything that had ever flown before. The aircraft entered operational service with the 9th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing at Beale Air Force Base in California. And almost immediately, it began rewriting the record books. The SR-71 could cover 100,000 square miles of territory in a single hour of flight. Its cameras and sensors capable of photographing an object as small as a license plate from 80,000 feet could survey an entire country in an afternoon. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because speed and altitude weren't actually the SR-71's biggest challenge, it was fuel. The SR-71 burned through JP-7 jet fuel at a staggering rate, roughly 8,000 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Its internal tanks held around 12,000 gallons. Do the math. Without aerial refueling, the Blackbird's operational radius was dangerously limited. Every major mission required a carefully choreographed ballet of KC-135Q. Tanker aircraft, a specially modified variant of the standard tanker configured specifically to handle JP-7. It was so chemically stable it couldn't even be ignited with a match at ground level. Pilots would take off from Beale or from forward operating locations like Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. Immediately rendezvous with a tanker, top off their fuel tanks, and only then accelerate to operational speed. At the mission's end, they'd often need another tanker waiting. Miss that rendezvous mechanical problem, weather, timing error, and the mission was over. Or worse, the crews who flew these missions were an unusual breed. Each SR-71 carried a pilot and a reconnaissance systems officer, or RSO, responsible for managing the sensor suite and navigation. Both wore full-pressure suits identical in function to what astronauts used because at 85,000 feet, the atmosphere is so thin that a pressure suit failure would be fatal within seconds. One of the most decorated crews in the program's history was Habu pilot Majors Jerry O'Malley and Edward Payne, who flew some of the most sensitive missions over North Vietnam and the Middle East during the early 1970s. O'Malley would later rise to become a four-star general, but in those years, he was threading an aircraft the size of a small airliner through corridors of airspace where a single navigation error could trigger an international incident. And those missiles kept coming. Over the course of the SR-71's operational life, Soviet and North Vietnamese air defense networks fired more than 4,000 surface-to-air missiles at Blackbirds. Not one ever hit its target. The aircraft's speed made it geometrically impossible by the time a missile could calculate an intercept point and reach altitude. The SR-71 was already miles past that point, simply gone. But the Soviets were learning, and the threat was evolving. The SA-5 Gammon missile system, deployed in the late 1960s, had an engagement envelope that genuinely gave SR-71 mission planners pause. Flight routes had to be carefully calculated to avoid giving Soviet radar operators the geometry they needed. And certain areas, certain target sets that American intelligence desperately wanted to cover simply became unreachable. That was the limit no one talked about publicly. The Blackbird wasn't omnipotent. There were places it couldn't go, targets it couldn't photograph. Times when the most advanced reconnaissance aircraft ever built had to turn away from exactly the intelligence it was sent to gather. In 1976, SR-71 crew majors James Sullivan and Noel Whittyfield set a record that still stands, flying from New York to London in 1 hour, 54 minutes, and 56 seconds. An average speed of over 1,800 miles per hour. The Concorde made that same crossing in roughly 3.5 hours. Think about that for a moment. A military reconnaissance aircraft built in the early 1960s, still the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever to fly in operational service. 60 years later, nothing has replaced it. Nothing that flies today goes faster. The program was officially retired in 1990, briefly reactivated in 1995, and then shut down for good in 1998, a decision that reconnaissance specialists and military historians have debated ever since, particularly as satellite technology still cannot provide the real-time, low-angle, on-demand imagery that the SR-71 was uniquely capable of delivering. Some of those debates are still happening in classified briefing rooms today. If you enjoy real, untold stories from the hidden side of military aviation history, make sure you're subscribed, because there are dozens more missions, aircraft, and operations that history barely remembers. And we're just getting started. Sonnet 4.6